Hey, what's up guys? Today we're going to talk about the best DPS characters in Genshin Impact in this top 5 video. Now before we get into the top 5, there's a lot of important disclaimers and sort of guidelines that I have to cover to make this video very clear and so you understand how we're ranking the characters. And an immense amount of time, research, and effort has gone into this video. It took me so long to make, just so that I could be as objective as possible with this ranking. That being said, you are allowed to disagree, but it is a ranking based on specific criteria that I set and that we will go over in the first section of this video. And I also want to give a quick shout out to Zajef77, my friend and math guy, who helped me with this video. With that being said, I want you guys to know that I stream most nights on Twitch. Link in the description if you're interested. Be sure to sub if you're new, and let's get into it. So first of all, the first thing I want to talk about is actually define what a DPS character is. And personally, I tend to just define a DPS as the main damage dealer, the character dealing the most damage per second, who is usually on field. The reason I want to specify this is because a character like Xiangling, some people will think is purely a support, but as you guys know, a character like Xiangling or even Beidou have comps where they shine exceptionally well as a DPS. Without going into too much detail, you guys can see it on screen right now, the national team, which is a team consisting of Xiangling and Xingqiu, where Xiangling is clearly the DPS, doing all the damage with their Pyronado. Another big thing I want to talk about is the importance of AoE, the being able to deal damage to multiple enemies at once, because at the end of the day, this top 5 is catered towards endgame content, which right now is basically just Abyss. Since the current Abyss and the previous Abysses have all been multiple enemies, like it's very rare to just have a single target enemy, having good damage against multiple enemies, having consolidated AoE is very important. And so while single target can be nice, it's usually a downside if all your damage can only be done to one enemy at the same time, whereas a character who can do similar amounts of damage to like 10 things at the same time will obviously be favored in the current endgame content. Lastly, and most importantly, is how we're comparing these characters. Now, first of all, I'm trying to take into account every level of investment. So overall, for most players, what you'd expect. And like the ranking at like super high investment can change compared to just overall or even lower investment. But most importantly, I'm comparing C0 5 stars to Constellated 4 stars. Now, the reason for this is because I believe going for constellations on 5 stars is somewhat unrealistic, or it's a very small percentage of the player base that will actually have like a C6 Hu Tao or something. And at that point, when your 5 stars have constellations, they're usually just much better than the 4 stars. On top of that, most people, even free-to-play who've been playing Genshin for a while, will eventually get some 4-star constellations. It's much more realistic and something that I believe is worth considering, especially because 4 stars are featured on many different banners, whereas a lot of the 5 stars are limited time only. So yeah, those are the general guidelines: C0 5 stars and usually constellations on 4 stars. Also, something very important to keep in mind is that this is a sustained DPS tier list. This list is based off of the average DPS, just consistent DPS that your character will be doing throughout all levels of investment. However, there are some characters whose bursts at speedrun levels of investment, so very high investment, can clear faster than other characters who just have solid, consistent DPS. An example of this, and we'll talk about these characters later in the video, but like when you look at Xiao, he just deals constant damage all the time. A character like Eula, however, has a huge burst damage in one hit, and then after that she has quite a lot of downtime during her cooldown and to get her burst back. And the reason I'm talking about this is because the characters with the burst damage get a lot better at speedrun levels of investment when you can clear in one rotation and just get that fast like 10 or 20 second clear. However, at most levels of investment, average to even high, characters that rely on their burst can be a lot worse than consistent DPS if you can't quite clear in 1 or 2 rotations. Now, they are still good characters. It's just for the sake of ranking, you do have to keep in mind that it does highly depend on your investment, which is why in this video, we're going to be taking everything into account at every different level of investment and talk about when specific characters can be better or worse than where I place them on this list. Also, for the reasons I'll explain later in the video, there are 2 characters tied at number 5, so it is sort of a top 6 because they both have different roles and niches where they shine exceptionally well. So I've been really indecisive between the 2, and for now they are tied. And finally, I just want to quickly say that I know a lot of people come into these videos with their preconceived notions of what's top 5 to them, and if the list doesn't perfectly match, then there's a lot of drama, especially in like comment sections and stuff. And you have to keep in mind that in Genshin, a lot of characters are better or worse depending on what they're fighting, given like the frame you set them in, right? What constellation, what investment level. There's a lot of factors that change, that can depend. So that is why I'm ranking this list as objectively as possible in one specific scenario within the criteria that I set, right? So no constellations on the 5 stars, but higher constellation 4 stars for the current endgame content, which is Abyss, trying to 36 star it, so that the ranking makes sense and isn't as subjective as if I were to just pick who I think the best DPSs are without any guidelines. And obviously, I'm going to be explaining the ranking for every character in as much detail as possible, so you can understand where I'm coming from. I hope this section wasn't too long, and with all that being said, let's get into the top 5. The first character I want to talk about in this video is Eula. Eula is a very decisive character. Some people swear by her and believe she's like the strongest DPS, and others really hate her and call her damage per screenshot. So what I want to do first of all is explain her strengths and weaknesses and where I believe Eula is placed in a tier list. The thing with this character is that she is very unique because she's a strong burst carry with the highest potential burst damage in Genshin. That means she can one-shot a lot of the content and can be very good for like speedrunning. Eula is a character who scales very well with investment, meaning someone with very high investment on their Eula will get a lot more value than like a low investment or even an average investment Eula. In fact, she only really becomes better than a lot of other characters on this list at max investment, at speedrun levels of investment where you can clear everything in 1 or 2 rotations. The reason for that is because the damage during her downtime, when her burst, which has a high energy cost and a long cooldown, is on cooldown, she'll deal less consistent damage than the other characters on this list. That being said, with very high crit damage and a burst team like a Lisa Bennett, where you're just speedrunning content, Eula can be one of, if not the best, at just clearing very fast. So I want to make it very clear in this video the sort of duality of Eula. On one hand, at low, medium, or even just high investment until you reach that max investment level, she's a pretty good carry, but not as good as the other characters we're going to talk about when you just factor in their average DPS over like a full abyss clear. However, when you are in that speedrun level of investment range, she becomes one of, if not the best, at clearing content rapidly. For those reasons, I believe I have to put her in the top 5, tied at number 5 with the next character we're going to talk about. Since she is so good at max investment, I feel it would be a sin not to talk about her and acknowledge her strength in that regard. And do keep in mind, part of the reason why so many people overvalue Eula is because of her damage in those like showcases where she's max investment, super high crit damage, maybe lower on the crit rate, and especially if she has like her constellations, because Eula's damage at C6 is just multiplied exponentially. And so if for you what matters is speedrunning content and who's the fastest at max investment, Eula will definitely move up on the list. Whereas if you're someone trying to get your first 9-star floor 12 clear at lower or medium levels of investment, Eula isn't as powerful as the next characters we're going to be talking about. For those reasons, I believe she is tied at number 5 with the next character on this list. Now we're going to talk about a more unexpected character, probably the most underrated one on this list, a character who is still widely believed to be a support, but whose role as a DPS is something that shouldn't be overlooked, and was a very powerful one at that. That character is Beidou. Beidou is a character with an absolutely massive scaling on her abilities. Her counter does an insane amount of damage, and her burst, as you can see by the numbers on screen, scales extremely well with investment. And against exactly 2 enemies, Beidou's burst is going to do way more damage than Eula's. The scaling is just higher because of the way bounces work. And to go more in detail, against exactly 2 enemies, Beidou is probably just the strongest unit in the game, but that's not just when she's good. Against anything more than 2 enemies, so 2, 3, or just multiple enemies, Beidou is still an amazing unit because her ult will start bouncing between them, dealing massive amounts of electro damage. And while single target is Beidou's main weakness, number 1, that doesn't happen too much in Genshin endgame, and number 2, her team comps usually cover her for that front. By running Fischl and Xingqiu, you usually have that single target covered just by your off-field supports. Now I know some people still don't consider Beidou to be a DPS, but even in team comps where she's undeniably one, right? Like the one you're seeing on screen with Beidou auto-attacking with Xingqiu and Fischl supporting her from off-field, this is a team comp that does exceptionally well, and Beidou is clearly the DPS here. The only non-traditional thing about this comp is that it's her burst and her skill doing the most damage, and not just her normal attacks. That being said, in a game like Genshin Impact, you can't rate DPS characters based on who does the highest normal attacks, so I believe it's undeniable that Beidou can be considered a DPS. On top of that, even in the Childe firework comp, where Childe is the one auto-attacking, Beidou's usually doing more damage than him, especially against 2 or 3 enemies. Another misconception regards the energy cost of her burst. While it is 80 and it seems high, running Beidou as a main DPS who's on field to pick up the particles really doesn't need a lot of energy recharge as long as you run her with Fischl, who's an electro battery for her. On top of that, Beidou's burst actually snapshots. If you don't know what snapshotting is, I'm going to define it right now for the whole video. Basically, it's a property that certain abilities have to where if you buff your character, all of their buffs, all of their stats are factored in at the start of the ability. That means that if you use Bennett ult, Thrilling Tales, or whatever you do to buff your Beidou, when she presses her burst, all those buffs will be factored in not only at the start of the burst, but for the whole duration. That is huge because it means that your buffs will basically never expire and that your whole burst will deal more damage. And in case you're wondering why Beidou and Eula are tied, Beidou comes out on top at sort of most levels of investment, so like lower to mid investment, especially for getting your first 36-star Abyss clear, whereas Eula is a lot better at hyper investment to speed clear in in 1 or 2 rotations. Because of that, I felt it was appropriate to tie them. However, given the criteria of this video, I usually recommend beidou until the very late game. Also, since I believe this video has a chance to reach people that aren't in my typical audience, I feel like I should specify that beidou being Electro isn't a big deal, and I know a lot of people can't really fathom that like an Electro DPS can be better than a Pyro one or a Hydro one because of the way reactions work, but basically beidou's scalings are so high that even if you don't use reactions on her, she is undeniably one of the strongest carries. And while yes, Electro doesn't have the best reactions, it doesn't matter if you're literally killing everything with your insanely high scalings, even out DPSing characters like Diluc who can vaporize on their hits. And obviously, if you're running beidou with a Hydro support, you do get that bonus damage from Electro Charged. And honestly, I've been really afraid to talk about beidou, but hopefully I explained why I believe she's so powerful, and I can understand people that just want to play her as a support. That's perfectly fine, but I tried to explain why she's so powerful as a DPS, especially against 2 or 3 targets, which the current Abyss heavily favorizes. For number 4, we have Hu Tao. Hu Tao is an amazing carry who is potentially the best in her niche. It might surprise people to see her at number 4 and not higher, but there's a clear explanation for this, and that is mainly because of what I said at the beginning of this video. Hu Tao is a character who gets significantly better with her first constellation. I believe C1 Hu Tao is a lot stronger than C0 Hu Tao because of the insane DPS increase that being able to spam your charge attacks will provide your Hu Tao. That being said, Hu Tao has a pretty good sustained DPS with a very good burst DPS as well, making her pretty good overall. She also has an upside of not needing support characters like Bennett, who other pyro DPSs like xiangling really want. On top of that, Hu Tao is the best in her niche, which is against 1 target. Now, while I mentioned the importance of AoE, right, being able to damage multiple enemies at once, she is exceptionally powerful against 1 enemy, which means if the Abyss changes, if the future endgame content is catered towards 1 big enemy, Hu Tao will be much more valuable and potentially even the strongest. That being said, for the current endgame content, which is largely AoE, Hu Tao is great, but lacks a bit of AoE that other characters like xiangling have. And while, spoiler alert, we're going to talk about xiangling later, the comparison between Hu Tao and xiangling isn't really something I've done on YouTube so much as I've done on my stream many times. And the conclusion from me and basically every other theory crafter is that Hu Tao is great, but xiangling against more than 1 enemy, so as soon as you're fighting 2 enemies, 3 enemies, or even just a mob of enemies, xiangling becomes a lot stronger because her Pyro Nado will constantly vaporize everything around you, whereas Hu Tao can mainly focus on super high single target damage with an okay AoE burst that can do like 100k every pop. And while that burst is nice and makes Hu Tao a very powerful DPS that you should play, it's not enough to make her more powerful than some of the other characters on this list, given the current endgame content and the importance of AoE in Genshin, as I mentioned in the intro. That being said though, Hu Tao's DPS is very good, and she's a pretty versatile unit to where, yes, she needs like Xingqiu in her team, but apart from him, the other 2 characters can be support characters that aren't as high priority, Kaya and Diona, or just characters that you're not using in your other team. On top of that, Hu Tao gets significantly better with quote-unquote whale upgrades, some more expensive things for your Hu Tao like Staff of Homa or your Constellation 1, which makes her a lot more powerful. And so because of that, I can understand why some people think Hu Tao is even better than she is, or deserves a higher ranking than where I put her. And if you're considering Hu Tao with her Constellation 1, then I can agree. And do keep in mind that a lot of people and a lot of showcases that you see do have a Constellation 1 Hu Tao. So a lot of people's opinions on her are sort of based around that. But for the sake of fair ranking, considering Hu Tao at C0 and through all levels of investment, she places herself at number 4 on this list. Coming in at number 3, we have Xiao. Xiao is such an amazing character that I don't really know where to begin. I guess I'll start by explaining why he's so powerful and then clear up some misconceptions regarding this character. So the main reason why Xiao is so powerful is because he not only does a lot of damage with all of his kit, like all of his plunge attacks during his burst, but he can also do it very efficiently to everything around him. His AoE is very well consolidated, meaning that every plunge attack you do, whether you're against 1 enemy, 2 enemies, or 500 enemies, as long as they're next to Xiao, that plunge attack will do the same damage to all the enemies at the same time. And while his damage against a single enemy or even just 2 is pretty good, the more enemies there are that he can constantly plunge, the more damage he's going to be dealing since his plunges hit everything around him. On top of that, against specific enemies, you can utilize some advanced techniques like charge attacking and low plunging, but generally speaking, Xiao shines very well against multiple opponents. On top of that, he's very friendly towards every playstyle, and while his skill ceiling can be high, his skill floor to just start doing well is quite low. And honestly, even if you don't really know what you're doing, just spamming plunges should be enough to just clear anything around you, especially in places like Abyss. Now, one annoyance Xiao can have is that sometimes spamming plunges, especially low plunges, can knock enemies too far away to keep plunging them, but you can very easily push enemies into each other, or you can run another Anemo character that clumps up enemies to group them up before you start plunging. A big misconception around Xiao, which I think now has mostly been debunked, but a lot of people were believing near his release that he needed much more energy recharge than he actually does. That is however untrue. Like many other characters on this list, he really doesn't need that much ER. Honestly, just running like 120 with a good team comp, good rotations, meaning like an Anemo battery to generate particles for you, and maybe someone like Fischl will be more than enough to get your burst up on cooldown if you're playing Xiao optimally. By not needing too much ER, that obviously lets you build more damage, and while Xiao is a hyper carry who you should invest your resources into, he's also good at low or mid investment, making him very good at all stages of the game. And since he's a hyper carry, he's a lot easier to invest into, since you can just focus all of your resources into Xiao, whereas your support characters can be underleveled or underinvested, and you'll still perform very well. And so Xiao's overall strength just being high and up there, and the fact that he can do it against every enemy at the same time, right? While Hu Tao might have a lot more single target damage, Xiao against multiple enemies will greatly outperform her. And it took everything in my power to just be as objective and non-biased as possible as someone who's played Xiao for many, many, many hours. But overall, Xiao is just a great DPS who doesn't have much burst damage, so it's not very flashy. Like, he's not going to do 1,000,000 damage in one hit, but he does have very high, consistent, sustained DPS, constantly damaging everything around him with big hit after big hit throughout the entire duration of his burst, which you can spam on cooldown. For those reasons, I believe it's undeniable that Xiao is just a very powerful carry in Genshin Impact. Coming in at number 2, we have a character who is long underrated and who has recently been starting to get a lot more appreciation, especially due to the national team being popularized in NA as well. And so the character we're going to talk about is Xiangling. If you don't know why Xiangling is such a powerful carry, it's because her Pyronado has a ridiculous scaling and deals damage to everything around her. Similarly to Xiao and other characters on this list, Xiangling does exceptionally well against multiple enemies, and while her damage, even single target, is pretty good, that same damage can be applied to 2, 3, or even 10 enemies because of her Pyronado being able to hit everything around her. While many people still play and consider Xiangling to be a support, similarly to beidou, her DPS is absolutely insane, and I believe it's usually a wasted potential to run her as a support. Her damage is basically like doing deluxe damage to one enemy, but doing it simultaneously to everything around her by just vaporizing every single hit of your Pyronado, which does insane amounts of damage. In team comps like the national comp, it's undeniable that she's the main carry, and even in Childe Xiangling teams, Childe is just an enabler, applying Hydro very fast for your Xiangling to vaporize and deal a ton of damage to everything around her. And honestly, I usually evaluate people's game knowledge by seeing who they think is the main DPS in a Childe Xiangling team, because as you can see, like, Childe is doing an okay amount of damage, but Xiangling is constantly coming in vaping like 40 or 50k, whereas Childe is mainly there to apply Hydro for your Xiangling. One of the reasons why many people might not consider Xiangling to be that good is because she's very difficult to play and requires a very strong team. Xiangling, I believe, is dependent on Bennett because Bennett is her pyro battery, being able to funnel particles into your Xiangling as seen on screen, pressing E on Bennett, swapping to Xiangling to catch the particles to allow you to run very low energy recharge on your Xiangling. On top of that, his burst buffs your Pyronado, and since your Pyronado does snapshot, the Bennett buff will last for its entire duration. On top of that, your other two support characters are also very important. Running a Hydro support or enabler like Xingqiu or Childe, allowing your Xiangling to vaporize on every hit, will push your Xiangling to that next level, and then your last character is usually someone like Sucrose, Kazuha, or even Zhongli to amplify your damage even further. And in case you're wondering, the reason for that is because a character like Sucrose, for example, can run the very powerful Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers to amplify your Xiangling's Pyronado, giving her 48% attack, which is a buff that will snapshot for the whole burst. On top of that, Sucrose or any Anemo unit will reduce the resistance of enemies by 40% to Pyro, because that's what you're going to be swirling, and Sucrose will also give you a ton of elemental mastery with her passives. Also, something to keep in mind is that Xiangling's 4th constellation does increase the Pyronado's uptime by 40%, which is an absolutely huge upgrade that boosts her DPS even more, allowing you to have that Pyronado out for a very long time. And if for some reason you're still not convinced of how good Xiangling is, maybe you think she's okay but don't understand why she's like number 2 here, the scaling on her Pyronado, if you just look at it, like the Pyronado damage on every swing is 200%, and it lasts for 14 seconds, right? 10 plus the 4 seconds from your constellation 4, and it can vaporize every hit. That means that every swing you do, regardless of if you're low, mid, or high investment, will be doing a lot of damage if you play her in an optimal team comp. And while I have played Xiangling throughout multiple levels of investment, right now at very high investment, my Xiangling can do from 40k to 50k to everything around her on every vaporize. And it lasts for an insane amount of time, 14 seconds with her Constellation 4. Now, I was debating putting Xiangling or Xiao at number 2, but Xiangling's scalings and just the calculations Zajef has done in the past plus my personal experience, make me rank Xiangling above Xiao for her pure just higher damage, although Xiao is more consistent and requires less setup and is less reliant on valuable supports, whereas Xiangling needs like Bennett and a Hydra support like Xingqiu or Childe. Lastly, while Xiangling can have energy problems, as a main DPS, if you're funneling particles correctly, as I mentioned earlier, she can run on pretty low energy recharge. And by low, I mean I usually run her on 125 to 130, 135, which is more than enough if you're playing her properly and funneling particles while you attack. In fact, while Xiangling is the main carry, and you are weaving in some normal attacks to apply your Xingqiu's range swords, you're spending most of your time pressing E on Bennett, swapping to Xiangling, doing a bit of autos, and then swapping back to Bennett, pressing E, generating those pyro particles all the time, taking advantage of Bennett's very low cooldown. And if you're wondering why I'm explaining rotations and going so much in detail, it's because I know in advance a lot of people are going to disagree with my list, so I'm trying to explain as clearly as possible how to play the characters efficiently to really showcase their potential and why they're so good. Because if you play Xiangling not knowing why she's good or how to use her and like optimize her rotations, you might not notice her strength or get as much value as a character who can just spam their normal attacks without thinking too much. That being said, Xiangling's DPS is insane, and that is why I rank her as number 2. And finally, coming in at number 1 as the best DPS in Genshin, it should really be no surprise to anyone that we are talking about Ganyu. Ganyu is an amazingly powerful unit, the strongest DPS in Genshin at just most investment points for basically any content, no matter what you're doing, for many, many reasons. First of all, if you don't know why Ganyu is so good, let me explain. Her scalings on her abilities is absolutely insane. Her charge shots just do a ridiculous amount of damage for no good reason. As you can see, I'm only talent level 6, so this does greatly increase with talent levels, as I am still very low level. But you can see that a Frostflake arrow already does a good amount of damage, and then the bloom will do 300 or more percent, right? 300 at level 6, and it goes even higher than that, which is insane considering it's AoE, right? Area of effect to everything around the arrow, and it's cryo, so it can proc reactions like freeze or melt, which can either freeze enemies in place or multiply the damage by 1.5 by reverse melting. And just to give you an example of how good this scaling is, if we look at something like Diluc's ult, right, which I have level 8, the slash damage is also around 300%. And the thing with Ganyu is that her charge shots have no real cooldown, right? There's a bit of time it takes to charge it up, obviously, because it's a charge shot, to do this Frostflake arrow, but it isn't an ability, it's not her burst, it's not something you have to wait to deal this damage. She just has a ridiculous scaling on everything she does, on every single arrow that she fires. On top of that, her skill is a taunt that's very useful, and her burst, paired with Venti and even Mona, can be very good and very useful against multiple enemies. In fact, running Ganyu with Venti and Mona is widely regarded to be just the best team in the game, and the last character can be someone like Diona or Jean, but those 3 core 5 stars have an immense amount of synergy because Venti clumps up the enemies, Ganyu's burst will rain down those icicles on every enemy in the burst, and Mona will give you some damage and allow you to freeze enemies basically permanently, which keeps you safe from harm and allows you to run the Blizzard Strayer set, which gives you 40% crit rate, which is always just nice. Now, personally, I can't show you footage of that comp because I just don't have Mona. I have every single character except Mona, but there are also other good Ganyu comps like the Melt Ganyu you're seeing right now, where you're running her with Bennett and either Xiangling or Kazuha to constantly apply Pyro, with either Xiangling's Pyronado or Kazuha's Burst swirling that Pyro, allowing your Ganyu to melt and do insane amounts of damage. And while her freeze comp is usually the best, there are multiple ways to play Ganyu, all of which are pretty insane, and this is a video focused more about the character than the team comps, but her teams are so good that they're definitely worth mentioning, just to show you guys Ganyu at like her full potential. Honestly though, there's not much more to say. Ganyu just has ridiculous scalings and just pretty much just good at everything. For that reason, it's been widely accepted by the community that she is just the strongest DPS, and it is something that I agree with because she is insanely powerful. Also, some clarifications regarding this list. The reason Childe wasn't mentioned is because, as I said in the Xiangling section, he is mostly more an enabler than a DPS. While he does do a pretty good amount of damage on field, he does less than the characters he's enabling by attacking very fast and applying Hydro very fast. He lets your Xiangling or your beidou shine very well and do even more damage than him. So in team comps like Childe, Xiangling, Bennett, and Sucrose, Childe is the enabler, the on-field auto attacker, when Xiangling is the real carry. And if you're wondering why characters like Diluc aren't mentioned, Diluc is basically just a slightly worse Hu Tao at single target, and is worse than Xiangling against multiple enemies, because while his burst is very good against multiple enemies, Xiangling just does it better. Lastly, I'm not including Melt Bennett because I believe Bennett is better used as a support, because he's crucial to DPSs like Xiangling, who will outperform him. With all of that being said, I'm honestly quite afraid to upload this video, because I know know it's going to be my most controversial one yet. I know a lot of people are going to disagree, and that's fine. Now, a lot of time and effort has gone into this video. It's been by far the longest video of mine to make. It took me like over a week. I had to like pause to make other videos in between, and I was very indecisive on a lot of characters on this list, notably where I should put Eula, especially with her or beidou being number 5. And if there's anything I want to add in the future, as always, it will be in a pinned comment. And also keep in mind that while there are some DPSs who are better than others, Genshin isn't that difficult of a game, so you should play who you like. That's really what matters in this game. So with all that out of the way, those are my top 5 DPSs in Genshin. And I don't normally ask for likes or anything, but if you did enjoy it, feel free to like it because it means a lot. And since this video is going to generate a lot of sort of controversy, I will pay extra attention to the comments, so feel free to ask any questions. If you're new, obviously feel free to subscribe. You can join the Discord if you want to. Shout out to Zajeff77, my math guy. His links are in the description as well. And with all of that finally being said, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace. Coming in at number 1, the real best DPS in Genshin Impact is definitely Barbara because of the insane scaling on her charge attack.